Here are just some ways to make line. I'm just using an ordinary pencil here. I can switch hands. I can make a long, easy line. My line can describe a shape. I can do a scribble. I can do sort of a jerky kind of line here. Kind of awkward. I can do a dotted line. So that's just one tool. Here's graphite. This is a graphite stick or a graphite crayon. This comes in water-soluble and not water-soluble, and I urge you to use the not water-soluble for this exercise because we're painting over these lines and the paint will smudge drastically if you use the water-soluble. So this has the capacity for a nicely kind of crude line. Another one of my favorite tools are these paint markers. This one is Montana, but there's other companies that make them. And this is acrylic paint in the marker, so it won't bleed through the paper like some Sharpie markers will. Another paint marker, a little different tip. And yet a finer tip. I think my left is really my dominant for drawing. I'm just using the right hand because the camera is on the left. And then Pitt pens. These are India ink, which is reasonably permanent. It may smudge a little bit under paint, but I'm going to show you how to fix the marks before painting over. And Pitt pens come in a whole lot of different tips and colors. For now we're using black and white, but here, for example, is a Pitt pen with a brush tip, which I've used quite a bit, so it's blunted a bit. But you can get varying thicknesses of line with this. And here is the same thing in a gray Pitt pen. In this exercise we're using just black and white and shades of gray. So if you have some gray markers, that's great. If not, that's fine. Here's another gray marker. This is a paint marker from Liquitex. I think the color is called Parchment. Another thing I want to show you is a white paint marker, which of course white on white isn't going to show you much, but once you've got a piece in process like this, a white marker can really show up quite a bit over the grays. Just adds a little subtle accent. And back to the graphite here. I want to show you the difference between a mindful line and a kind of mindless doodle. As I'm drawing this line, I'm really paying attention to where it's going, and there isn't a way that it should go or shouldn't go, but I'm paying attention to every step. Whereas if I'm kind of talking on the phone or watching TV or something, I could just, do this kind of careless line, and it has a different quality. Here's another example. I could do this to make a pattern using line, or I I could slow down and pay attention to each one of these elements. But when I pay attention and slow down, it's going to have a really different feel from if I just dash it off. Here's another example. It's kind of dashed off. I could have a lot more fun if I really pay attention to this line and maybe vary each segment just a tiny bit, but in a more deliberate and mindful way. I'm not saying that every single line needs to be done at this slower speed. Just notice the difference and make sure that you're not dashing off every single line, but paying attention. There's sometimes when you might want a sort of spontaneous scribble, and sometimes not. So this is the first piece I painted, and it's got paint marker and graphite and pencil. And I just hit it with a hairdryer to make sure that the paint marker is dry, but just to make sure it doesn't smear. I'm going to take a little matte medium on my brush and do this kind of once over. Really one gentle coat. You can see it'll smear just a tiny bit. I'm going to do that over the graphite too. So once this is dry, I'm going to do this over the whole page, and once it's completely dry, then I can paint over it and the lines won't smear. One way to layer paint in a kind of veil over your lines is by using a brayer. So give yourself ample room to roll out your paint on your palette. Piece back in the frame here. And this piece, I've already fixed the drawing with matte medium and then dried it with a hairdryer. So the paint is unlikely, well, the paint and graphite from the lines is unlikely to lift. So you'll notice as I apply paint with the brayer, I get a certain thickness of paint, and then as I roll it around and spread it out, it kind of spreads the layer just a bit thinner. So this is a nice way to get a first coat of a real thin layer or a veil of white paint over your lines. By comparison, let's just use this other piece, and I haven't fixed the lines here, so they may smear a little bit. It'll be a good demonstration of that. Okay, this time I'm just going to use the brush, and I'm mixing my white paint. This is matte medium, this is white paint. I'm using just a little of the matte medium in the white. And that's to make it a little more translucent. So I can use the brush. Yeah, you can see that the lines from the paint marker are smearing a bit. And that's not necessarily bad, you just want to notice. And then lifting it. So back to this first piece. You can combine, let's see, the brushing with the brayer by brushing paint on and then brayering it out. Okay, now this takes us to another technique I use quite a bit, and that is a sort of dry brush, which you get your paint or your paint mixed with medium on your brush, and kind of minimal paint, and you kind of drag it over the surface. And you can build up the paint in really gradual layers this way. So you can really control how much paint is going on the various parts over your lines. So here we have more opacity, here we have more transparency, here we have even more transparency. So once you've put the first layer of paint down and played with that opacity and transparency a little bit, you can add another layer of lines. And these lines will relate to the lines beneath them, which doesn't mean that they mimic them exactly, but you just pay attention to what they're doing. Fun place to use the white. You'll notice as you paint, your paper starts to curl. And one thing you can do to ameliorate that situation is use matte medium on the back. So I just scrape it with a credit card. That way it doesn't use very much medium, but it gets the whole back of the paper coated. Looks like it has a little red paint on it. And it will eventually lie flat. It also helps the paper to be just a little stiffer, gives it a little more body. And it makes the piece archival when both sides are coated with acrylic material. Then it will last longer than you will. So if you accidentally do a masterpiece on one of these pieces of cheap drawing paper, this is how you can make it archival. There, and that'll then curl the other way. Is that the other way or the same way? Anyways, it'll curl, but eventually as it dries it'll flatten out.